Greetings all. A pleasure to be able to speak to you today from Rotterdam in the Netherlands. I'm first going to tell you who I am and why I'm here, and then what you can expect from this session, the learning objectives, so to speak. So hello again to everyone watching and listening. I'm Dan Hasan, a student of science education at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And last year in February, I also started interning at FeedbackFruits, an edtech company based in Amsterdam, in the role of teacher relations. This meant going around to universities and helping to give workshops, training sessions to teachers and instructional designers about how to use our online tools to support and enhance course design. I was enjoying doing this, getting into the swing of things, and then the pandemic happened. As we stepped everything up to meet the surge in demand, I went from intern to trainee to full-time by the end of the year as we doubled our employees. And I'm new to instructional design. I'm not an experienced classroom teacher, and I'm not an authority in any institution. But even though I'm green, I want to show you what I've seen and what we've learned in the past year of talking to hundreds of instructors, designers, and technologists across higher education. So today, I'm honored to be able to share with you directly the use case of Dr. Fiona Baird, biology lecturer at Griffith Uni, about how she leveraged instructional technology for scalable, inclusive, and engaging education post-COVID. So before I launch into that, I just want to bring everyone up to speed on the structure of this session. First, I want to say a few things about engagement, inclusivity, and scalability, and I especially want to focus on engagement to begin with. Then we'll look at the actual tool Fiona used, which we call group member evaluation, and just briefly walk you through what it is and how we designed it to be used. Then you can see how it was actually used as I walk you through Fiona's use case. Finally, I'll ask anyone interested in our session to come to our booth for the last 10 minutes, chat with us directly, and answer any questions. Okay, apologies to anyone who we've worked with before. You've probably seen this image. We use it all the time, and that's for a reason. It's the most common complaint we've heard in the whole profession, that students on the whole sometimes just aren't engaged with the course overall. And over the pandemic, well, there's been even less organic opportunity for that. But what we see in this graphic is time on the x-axis and student activity and or engagement on the y-axis. That spike at the end is the final exam, when the cramming begins. This is firsthand familiar, I'll admit, but talking even with much more mature and professional students, you still see this coming up. Preparing for this end examination is a bunch of readings, tests, assignments, activities which don't necessarily stimulate active participation, save for those students with intrinsic motivation. But what happens when your learning activities align with your examination or other summative evaluation and are designed in a way which necessitates interaction, collaboration, and not just passive consumption of lecture after reading, after video, and so on? Well, turns out that with more interactive tasks, more collaborative tasks, more discussions, more peer feedback, that activity level, that engagement level gets higher and higher until we reach the nirvana of course design, which is students who want to learn and teachers that have everything they need to teach optimally. Now, this isn't to say that every sort of engaging activity I've mentioned works in every course, which is why we're going to zoom in on just one of them, and that's group member evaluation. Excuse me. So group member evaluation is a tool which, simply put, lets students who have been working in group projects evaluate each other, give each other feedback, let each other know how they've found working with their teammates. Okay, instant red flags. Group projects can be full of holes. There's free riding, lack of clear team roles or transparency, lack of communication, lack of visibility. And that's just the students. How do you, as an instructor designing your course, come up with a way to evaluate students, their group dynamics, as well as their individual contribution to work? I'm really bursting to tell you about Fiona's use case at Griffith, but I think it's just good for our more visual learners to have a very quick look through the tool interface and setup from the student's perspective in order to really apply what I'm going to tell you to what I'm going to show you now. So the group member evaluation tool is split up into 3 steps here. The first is instructions in the top left, where the instructor can prompt the student with instructions about the activity. Next, step 2 on the bottom left, an interface to give that feedback to their group members. And that happens according to some sort of rubric, which you'll see. But that next step in the top right is to read and reflect on the feedback they've received from their peers. And remember that this feedback isn't on handed in work, but on the teamwork process itself. Let's take a look at the rubric to get a better picture. Down these rows on the left, we can see some criteria, and these columns show which team member the feedback is for. You can see the scale goes from 0 to 4, which is a 5-point scale. So this is an interface of students selecting which score to give each team member for each criterion. Next is a very similar picture. The difference here is that you're not giving scores, but receiving them. And let me be clear, it doesn't have to be scores. It can be comments. It can be different scales, different criteria. That's at the teacher or course designer's discretion. Now, as a teacher, you will see an overview of all of this activity per group, with indicators for whether students have read instructions, finished a self-assessment, where they rate themselves as well, and how much feedback they've given. This is a nice overview to see which students might need more attention or guidance. And it's downloadable, so you can do some real data analysis too. And finally, who's heard of constructive alignment? I'm a huge fan of constructive alignment. I'm told it's called backwards design in the US. And why am I bringing it up? Because to my great pleasure, FeedbackFruits tools are built around this principle of aligning the learning objectives, the instructions at the start of the activity, with the learning activities, in this case, the feedback processing and the evaluation or assessment of learning outcomes. And that last assessment bit happens here in the grading. All these colors, names, and numbers are an overview of students' received scores multiplied by an adjustable group contribution factor here. That's the black number in the second from right column. And that adjustable group contribution factor makes the overall grading process even more fair and inclusive. And if I've attention baited you with that, ask me or the team afterwards in the booth, please. I've got so much to say about the group contribution factor, you wouldn't believe. But what happens when we look at an example, not of 1 or 2 groups in some screenshots, but with 550 students? How do we scale it up? Let's dive into Fiona's use case and take a look how it went. First, some overall metrics about the course. This introductory course in cellular biology saw 550 students study for 12 weeks, 1 trimester, delivering a final group poster presentation at the end. So a poster presentation in front of their classmates presented as a group. The students in this course were culturally and socially diverse, definitely not homogenous, but about 75% of those students were undergrads at 17 or 18 years old. Why am I mentioning this? Well, it turns out that not everyone enjoys feedback as much as we do at FeedbackFruits. Specifically, younger, lower level students find it more difficult to give and receive feedback about their work and skills because they take it personally. They struggle to structure their comments, and often they don't feel they have the authority to start judging their peers, let alone themselves. Feedback is an intrinsic and organic process, but constructive feedback is a whole nother picture. Put into the mix that you have a clash of Western and Eastern cultures, which to generalize have different ideas about directness, face, politeness, openness, etc. I did a few podcast episodes where I talked to students from the Caribbean, from the Netherlands, and from South Korea about their traditional encounters with feedback cultures, their own, their families, their schools, and it's very different. It's very telling and very crucial for teachers of diverse student cohorts to be aware when they're setting up inclusive feedback activities that these differences exist and that they don't necessarily mean that course design has to suffer. So why did Fiona want to use group member evaluation to help with this feedback process? Firstly, the native LMS lacked an option to monitor group work processes in such a large scale. So before, I'm not exaggerating, each of these 550 students previously had to hand in a piece of paper with their evaluations of their team written down. Just imagine every trimester, 550 pieces of paper at the end of the course stored away in a filing cabinet somewhere that never even got looked at afterwards. Moving this course online wasn't a matter of when, but of how. Which brings us to the second point, not just facilitating this process between students, but gaining oversight as a teacher, seeing, as we mentioned before, how each and every one of these students is faring, both individually and in their group. How did these 550 fare in their course then? Let's look at the setup. So they were split into small groups, 3 to 5, to research a topic in cell biology, make a poster about it, and present it to their classmates in one of those end of course symposium type sessions. It may have been more than one session because with the amount of groups, it's not going to fit into a 1 or 2 hour session. But after those presentations at the end of the course, they simply went home and completed these group member evaluation activities online. They scored each other according to criteria about the group work over the course of making that poster together. Things like punctuality, communication, contribution to the group work, and also things like being an amiable team member, someone who was pleasant to work with. They were scored on these sorts of things, on these criteria. And overall, the scores that they gave each other, plus the very act of giving feedback, altogether contributed 15% of each student's final grade. So when I interviewed Fiona about the overall outcome of using FeedbackFruits tools in her course, what did she have to say? Firstly, that students were more engaged in the feedback process, not seeing it as some optional, unimportant thing that they just have to make go away. But remember, 15% of the grade comes from taking the feedback seriously, taking the group work seriously, and contributing and being honest about their experience. So the number of students who were free riding, slacking, under contributing was significantly reduced, meaning less time needed to, dare I say, be wasted chasing up these students. And as you saw in the screenshots, there's a very nice visual overview of this data, which lets all the feedback be processed and viewed within one interface by the teacher. Let's take a moment for the old disused filing cabinets full of 550 yellowing pages of evaluation forms rusting on away in a basement somewhere. Next up, Fiona told us the tool worked great for herself and for her students. It was easy to manage and easy to set up, in her words. And there's a domino effect here. The instructors found it easier and simpler to make this course work, and thus the students benefited, giving each other richer and more constructive feedback than ever before. So I'm really grateful to have had the chance to speak to Fiona about her use case. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to work at FeedbackFruits and speak to amazing instructors, gathering these stories and insights, this feedback, after all. And I'm grateful to have been given the opportunity to share that with you here today. And I hope to have inspired you to take that extra step in looking at your course design. I'll leave this slide up here so you can see the 2 offers we have available, one of which is exclusive to the online ed session. So now I'll invite you to come along to our booth, take your questions there to our exhibition where we can meet in person and talk about this use case, your questions, these offers, or in general, how you can design your most engaging course yet. Thank you and see you in our booth.